The president was Jimmy Carter, and he told us not to have an irrational fear of communism. My professors told me that communism was inevitable and superior in every way. They told us that we should prepare for it and we should just accept it, lie down, because the Soviet Union was going to beat America eventually. And then Ronald Reagan was elected. And Ronald Reagan employed the most ingenious strategy for capitalism and free enterprise to win the rest of the world. The Cold War ended, and we now live in a free world as a result. Join me in the Economic War Room, where we'll talk with a friend of mine, Roger Robinson, really the man who architected the great economic war that won the Cold War. Roger, you're a hero of mine. You are, in my estimation, the Leonardo da Vinci of economic warfare. Some of my friends in Washington tell me if it weren't for the work that you and your team did during the Reagan administration, that Berlin Wall might still be standing. So we are so honored to have you come join us.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin.
Tell us a little about, for our viewers, what you did during the Reagan administration that made a big difference.
Well, as you know, I came out of Chase Manhattan Bank, where I was a vice president, division executive, ironically in charge of the Soviet Union and Central Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia for some 5 years, knew where the money was, knew what kind of creditworthiness they had, and more importantly, didn't have. And so I came to the Reagan administration with a good understanding of just how paltry their hard currency income and cash flow really was. The fact that they were spending more than they were making by about $16 billion a year, that their total hard currency income was only about $32 billion, roughly 1/3 of the earnings of GM or Exxon at the time, at least in terms of their total revenues. So it was a very sparse event. The Western banks and governments were funding 100% of that gap, that funding gap of, say, $16 billion annually that the Soviets otherwise couldn't meet. And so I came in with the notion that we need a new strategy here, which is to go after the Soviet hard currency cash flow. There's a lot that happens in rubles, as you know. Most of their trade takes place there. But if we just concentrated on the hard currency dimension, that this was where the dividends would be paid. And of course, 2/3 of that income was comprised of oil and gas deliveries. So they were really focusing on natural gas as their savior for the 21st century and arguably beyond. So I had was the first to really go after the Siberian gas pipeline project, which would have, in its final iteration, made Western Europe some 75% dependent on Soviet gas. It would have doubled those hard currency earnings. And so when the president was persuaded, when Soviet troops were massing on the border of Poland to invade there in December of 1981, and later in 1982, he was of the view that we would embargo our oil and gas equipment and technology to Moscow. This is something I strongly encouraged. And we had a monopoly on the kind of technology required to drill through permafrost, for example, because of our North Slope experience in Alaska. So we had a global monopoly on this kind of equipment that they needed for the Siberian tundra. So to make a long story short, we ensured that those contracts with American companies were abrogated. The Europeans picked them up instantly, even though they pledged they wouldn't. They proceeded to make these sales with our technology, mind you, under license. And so later in '82, the president was surprised by the fact that the Europeans didn't honor their commitments. He created an expansion of our sanctions to include U.S. licensees and subsidiaries abroad. This meant that they can't use our technology and equipment to continue to supply the Siberian gas pipeline. They objected. They tried to sell that equipment anyway, and we closed the entire American marketplace to those offending companies, making clear you can do business with the Soviet Union or the United States, but you're not going to do business with both. And I think that this was a decisive moment because Europe understood finally, after 4 of those 6 companies that were in violation of our sanctions, all went under within about a 6-month period, spilling 150,000 people into the streets of Europe unemployed. They started to get the idea of where their export destiny would lie, and it wasn't with the Soviet Union. So we came to an accommodation of limiting Soviet gas deliveries to Western Europe to 30% of total supplies. We ended those taxpayer-subsidized credits from Western governments. We helped dry up commercial bank lending to the Soviets so that we closed off those exit doors that they had in terms of Western financing. We tightened technology controls. We went to the Saudis and secretly arranged for the pumping of 2 million barrels more oil a day. We decontrolled prices at the wellhead, dropping prices down to $10 a barrel. And with every dollar drop in the price of a barrel of oil, it was costing the Soviets $500 to $1 billion each click, so to speak. So this was how we put them in an untenable position financially. And they stumbled along for a period of, say, 6-7 years, muddled through, until they defaulted on $96 billion in Western debt, something we had predicted. And it was over. Days later, the Soviet Union collapsed in December of 1991. There were many factors that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but I think none more potent than the economic and particularly the financial piece. So that's a little bit of the story that I had in very short form during the Reagan administration, and the role that I played, that the president kindly termed the architect of the economic and financial strategy for the takedown of the Soviet Union.
Well, that's fantastic. Basically, bottom line is, by cutting off access to Western markets and Western money, we were able to break communism in the Soviet Union. Fabulous. But now you're sounding a new alarm, and the new alarm is twofold. The Chinese communists are accessing Western markets and Western money, and that's a problem. And then the second aspect of it is, with that money, they're doing some pretty bad things. Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, the numbers are much more disturbing. As you know, China is an economic juggernaut, the likes of which the Soviets never knew, thank goodness. The situation we have here is, in the new era, it's really about stocks and bonds, namely our capital markets, that are the keys to the kingdom.
And not only that, they're actually forcing some investment through our MSCI All Country World Index, aren't they?
Yes. Look, you have as much as $1.9 trillion in our stock market. You have another trillion or so that we're exposed as Americans in their bond market, buying Chinese government bonds, particularly those of their state-owned enterprises. And so we're already talking about circa $3 trillion of financing that we're providing to the Communist Party and the Chinese totalitarian government. So this is a huge problem, and they're doing it in many different ways, including having our index providers like MSCI, like FTSE Russell, like Dow Jones, S&P, Bloomberg, Barclays, others, who are buying hundreds of Chinese companies right out of mainland exchanges, circumventing SEC regulations and disclosure requirements and the like, and are stuffing them into indexes which have trillions of dollars of funds under management that are automatically forced, in effect, to buy those stocks as soon as they appear in these indexes. And that is a huge problem, because it means that every time a Chinese company, including bad actors like the People's Liberation Army or human rights abusers, and we can go over some of who those bad actors are, but believe me, they're there, And as soon as they appear in an index, scores of millions of Americans automatically have them, in effect, inserted into their investment portfolios and their retirement accounts.
Well, now, wait a minute, Roger. I've been told, everybody's been told over and over that the Chinese are funding us, but what you're telling me is that we've been funding them.
That's correct. I mean, they have $1.1 trillion of our T-bills. By the way, if they ever sold them all, it would be not the calamity that people have predicted. It would be 50 or 100 basis points for us in interest rate rise. They don't have leverage, just to put that myth to bed. But they are funding us to the tune of about $1.1 trillion. In turn, they're taking out of our markets, both stocks and bonds, multiples of that amount. And they plan to put trillions of dollars more into our market in terms of the exposure of American investors in the next 2 to 3 years. So much so, Kevin, that the American people could well wake up one morning, that 150, 180 million Americans who are in our capital markets, and find out to their chagrin and even horror that they're holding 15, 17, 22, 25% of their entire investment portfolios are in Chinese securities. That's the day that we have a true crisis. That's the day we're in checkmate, and we have those 100+ million Americans, maybe 150, as many as 180, that are in their possession is a vested financial interest to ensure that penalties and sanctions levied against China no longer take place because of fear that they're going to damage the value of their retirement accounts and their investment portfolios,
Boy,
almost irrespective of how severe China's offenses are. And that's the day that we have to avoid, and we have to do it now.
Talk about a conflict of interest, and talk about a wake-up call. I mean, I thought that we owed them money, but what you're really saying is it's a fraction of what we have actually invested in them, and the money that's flown from American patriotic investors and gone into the Chinese communist nation. Tell me, what are some of the companies in the communist nation doing, and what are the things we should be worried about?
Well, I mean, among the companies that we've identified through our very extensive research on this challenge have been known proliferators. This is on China's front in terms of national security abusers. They have PLA companies. They have advanced weapons manufacturers. They have known hackers. They have the companies that are building and militarizing the illegal islands in the South China Sea. These are the companies that are helping keep North Korea a going concern and its advanced weapon systems as well. So we have an array of national security abusers there, many of which are sanctions violators. Some of them are under U.S. sanctions.
Wait. What you're saying is we're investing money in Chinese companies that are being sanctioned by our government?
That's a fact, an empirical fact. And if you look at the MSCI All Country World Index, for example, ex-US as it's called, they have 7 companies from Russia alone, all of which are sanctioned by the United States at this time. 7 out of 11 are under U.S. sanctions. In the case of China, you've got companies like Hikvision that are on the entity list, the so-called blacklist of the Commerce Department. You have China Mobile that is barred from any procurement by U.S. government officials because of national security concerns. You have ZTE, who, like Huawei, is practically a household name as a serial bad actor and proliferator to Iran, North Korea, and elsewhere. With our technology and our equipment, this is just the beginning. You have CCCC, one of the biggest Chinese construction and communications companies that were responsible for building the islands on the South China Sea. They're also in just this one index. And the reason that I'm choosing this index, because this is where they want to place the money, the retirement funds, of of all the international exposure of 5.7 million federal employees in the thrift savings plan of the United States. And that decision has been made by the board of the thrift savings plan back in November of 2017. If that's permitted to go forward and be implemented, all of the companies that I've mentioned and many of the bad actor categories that I've mentioned will all be in the portfolios of the members of Congress, the entire executive branch, the entire uniformed military, the entire intelligence community. If you have any exposure in the international fund of the thrift savings plan, you have no choices. All of the international fund, $50 billion, which most people will have for reasons of diversification, will be included in those investments, will be the companies that I've named and many of the bad actors that can't be named because of lack of time. But that's where we are today. That's how insidious this problem is.
Well, talk about the conflict of interest. Can you imagine that our soldiers and our congressmen and all those people that work in our government will have an economic incentive to go soft on China, to help China, to support China, rather than look out for the interests of the United States of America? That's appalling.
Well, listen to this, Kevin. It gets worse. What about the human rights abusers? What about Hike Vision and other such companies that have their surveillance cameras every few meters atop of the walls of concentration camps, holding well over 1 million Uyghur Muslim majorities in Xinjiang, China? What about the facial recognition technologies of Dawa Technologies Company and Hike Vision itself that are deployed at train stations in Tibet so that they can round up dissident Tibetans? I mean, Nancy Pelosi and others in Congress are champions of human rights, to their credit. They care about the Tibetans and they care about the Muslims in Xinjiang. But that said, what about the day when their retirement dollars, wittingly or unwittingly, are funding companies that are trampling the very human rights that they're championing? That's the kind of irony we had. So this isn't just national security practitioners. This isn't just folks like us who are deeply concerned over the vital security interests of our country. No, this is everybody who cares about human rights, everybody on the other side of the aisle, everybody that really is interested in values-based investing. In other words, having some relationship between their investment dollars and things they believe in, and certainly avoiding those things that they find anathema to everything they believe.
Well, not one penny should go to forced abortions, should go to persecuting religious minorities, Christians or Muslim. Not one penny should go to organ transplant harvesting. Not one penny should go to oppressing people and violating human rights. That's so offensive.
Today it's tens, hundreds of billions of dollars into the very enablers of the kind of horrific offenses that you're referring to now.
That's terrible. And we also talked with Kyle Bass, and Kyle says that even if we were making these investments and there was an investment reason to do it, there may be serious fraud here because we don't even know what these companies actually do and can't have access to shareholder rights or the ability to see their accounting.
Look, let's be clear. Kyle Bass is doing excellent work in this area, to be sure. The Chinese are not compliant with U.S. federal securities laws. They're not compliant with Dodd-Frank or Sarbanes-Oxley. They're not compliant with PCAOB, the broad overseeing accounting operation that makes sure that there's an independent audit of Chinese numbers. They're not even supplying the financials of their companies for American scrutiny because they're viewed as national security secrets. How convenient. So what do we have here? We have clear-cut preferential treatment given to Chinese Communist Party companies over those of their American corporate counterparts.
No, it's the exact opposite of what you did and your team and the Reagan administration did to defeat communism in the Cold War. They're actually flipped it on us, and we've got to do something about this. I can't stomach the idea that our patriotic veterans and our government employees are being forced to invest in things against our values collectively, and they might even be frauds. That's disheartening. That's terrible.
Well, even our former Secretary of the Navy, who's a great American, wrote an editorial in the Wall Street Journal bemoaning this very fact, and just in almost disbelief that his uniformed sailors and soldiers and those of our armed forces more broadly, are going to be unwittingly investing, with no disclosure I might add, investing in the advanced weapon systems trained against them to take them down and their brothers and sisters. I mean, the point is that this is a case where the DF-41 ICBM that featured very prominently in the 70th anniversary Communist Party parade in Beijing was produced by a firm called AVIC. Well, AVIC is in the MSCI All-Country World ex-US Index. That's the one that's supposed to go in and be the international fund or benchmark for the thrift savings plan, so that our armed forces, among other things, will be funding ICBMs targeted against their families and American cities and military installations.
That's unconscionable. Roger, thank you so much for helping us bring awareness to this important topic. I know there's some bills that are emerging in Congress where we would put a stop to the thrift savings plan in making investments in China, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? Ordinary Americans may unwittingly themselves have money invested in Chinese companies that Wall Street has sold them without regard to our nation's security, our values, or even the proper disclosures necessary to prevent accounting frauds. How can ordinary Americans address this serious threat?
Look, this is our money. We dominate utterly the economic and financial domain on this planet. We have over 60% of the world's liquidity or more in the U.S. capital markets. The size of our capital markets are roughly the size of the rest of the world's combined. This is our sandbox, not theirs. This is our money, not theirs. The point is that they have unfettered, unregulated, undisclosed access to the retirement dollars, the investment dollars of the American people in both stocks and bonds that are going to be our undoing if we don't get a handle on this right away and do the sensible things. I mean, even if we just enforce existing securities laws, even if we just have the SEC at long last do its job on disclosure of material risks like these national security and human rights abuses that are enabled by these Chinese companies that are putting at risk even the share value and corporate reputations of those Chinese companies, and hence everybody that invests in them. If we just had the most sensible, rudimentary steps taken, we could get a gradual handle on this thing right away. Isn't it interesting, Kevin, that you don't see it happening?
Well, we're going to start making it happen. We're going to put all of this in an economic battle plan, and we're going to get out to every American we can find, and we're going to put as much pressure on the SEC and Congress and everyone else to stop funding our adversary and start growing America. Thank you so much for your past service and bringing all of this important information to our attention today.
Thank you, Kevin.
Now, you've been informed, and with information and awareness, you have responsibility. You need to find out if perhaps your investments are funding our adversary. Maybe they're violating your values. Maybe you're funding against our sovereignty or our national security. We prepared a battle plan that will explain exactly how to find out if your investments are funding our adversary, what questions you should ask your advisor, and what you ought to be doing in this economic war. Remember, what we see as a marketplace, our enemies view as a battle space. Download your free battle plan at economicwarroom.com. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.